Who do you trust to run the NHS? Tonight, we're in Birmingham with a live audience who are going to talk about their experiences and to hear which party has the best solutions. Good evening and welcome to Newsnight, live in Birmingham. We are in the city's stunning Library of Birmingham with an audience, as you can hear and see, and with politicians, including the man who wants to be the next Health Secretary for England, Labour's Wes Streeting. We have the Lib Dems, Helen Morgan, who's with us tonight. We've got the SNP's Neil Gray, who is Health Secretary for Scotland. And for the Conservatives, it's Health Minister Maria Caulfield. Our audience this evening is broadly representative of the way people voted at the last general election, and there are some people here too who wanted to raise specific issues. So, let's get going. Let's hear from them. Hello, good evening, welcome to Newsnight.
Hello, I'm Stevie. I'm a small business owner from Manchester. I wanted to talk about my cancer diagnosis. I was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 37 in July last year. And it was sort of, at first, it all moved very quickly. I was very impressed at sort of how quickly my GP referred me. And I went to the breast clinic and was diagnosed pretty much on the day. And I then had to wait for the formal diagnosis, but it was a couple of weeks. And it all seemed to move very quickly. The point at which it slowed down was when I was waiting for the actual treatment. And I think I waited almost 4 months to have surgery to have the cancer removed.
And the target is what?
The target is 62 days, I think.
Okay. And just Stevie, just tell people what it's like when you've got a cancer inside of you and you are waiting to get it out.
It is horrific. And I know that anyone that's had cancer can relate to that. The feeling of having this thing in your body that's growing and you've got to just wait while for somebody to take it out of you is just, it was the longest 4 months of my life. And I remember getting the date for my surgery and thinking, this must be a mistake. This cannot be right. So I don't know if people are aware of PALS, but I think all hospitals have them. It's a sort of listening service for patients. And I called PALS at my hospital to say, you know, there's a 62-day target for the NHS for starting cancer treatment, and I'm looking down the barrel of 4.5 months. And the woman on the phone laughed. And said, she laughed, so I don't hold it against her, but it just, for me, it sort of shows the culture that exists in that particular hospital and presumably in others, where the very idea that a patient would expect that target to be met is laughed at by the people who are supposed to listen to you.
Who or what do you feel is responsible for that wait?
Well, I think partly it's just that more people are being diagnosed with cancer. So we know that, you know, the number used to be 1 in 3. It's now 1 in 2 of us at any point will get cancer in our lives. Presumably, there are administrative issues. There are huge waiting lists. I needed to have a mastectomy with a reconstruction, so 2 teams were involved, and the breast team and the plastics team sort of joining up slowed things down a little bit. But even then, you know, since then, if everything had gone as it was supposed to, I would have finished my treatment in April. But as it stands, I've only just finished chemo, and I got to my last chemotherapy and I hadn't heard anything about my radiotherapy, so I had to phone up to chase it, and I was told by the secretary that they just hadn't made the referral. Which has then delayed it further. Okay. And some of that has got to just be, you know, I want to be really clear that every single person that I've met in the NHS has been truly wonderful. I came home from a week in hospital after my surgery and I just cried because I didn't know what to do with all the emotion and the gratitude that I had for the people that had looked after me. So this isn't about the people, it's about the system, which is just not working. It's just not working. And people will get sicker and will have worse outcomes as a result.
Thank you very much, Stevie. Hello, sir.
I'm Stephen Blair. I'm a mental health advocate and a heating engineer from Walsall, West Midlands. I want to talk about GP appointments and accessing talking therapies and services through the GP. I can talk from personal experience. Trying to get an appointment with a doctor is hard at this point in time. Trying to access talking therapies, I've been given a 2-year waiting list.
2 years?
2-year waiting list to speak to somebody. They explained to me...
So, Steve, sorry to interrupt. So, like, how do you cope with the knowledge that it's going to take 2 years for you to talk to a professional about your mental health issues?
What can you do other than talk to other people around you and loved ones and that? I think I'm fortunate I'm part of a group called Men Talk, which is a support network just for men. You can find us on Facebook, which is like a safe place for men to talk about anything on their mind. As you know, men really don't talk about their problems. It's a big issue in society. It's something that needs to change. It's bad culture.
Okay.
So yeah, accessing appointments, talking services, it's just unrealistic. The last time I went to the doctors, I went about a different problem, but mentioned my mental health when I was there. And I was point blank refused and told it's only one problem per visit.
Yeah.
Also, I'm a heating engineer. I spend my days working in everybody's houses and talking to other people. I can tell you that, you know, it's a problem that's out there in society. It's not just my doctor's surgery. The other thing that concerns me as well, big time, is the cost of living right now is insane. And everybody's house that you go into, they're feeling the pinch. They're struggling.
And you see it. You see it.
Yeah, you can see morale's low. You can see it in them. You know,
Understood.
Everybody's struggling.
All right, Steve.
To me, that's just going to make the problem worse. How, if you can't access the services now, when this problem gets worse, what measures are going to be put in place to deal with this problem that the government has created?
Thank you. Hello.
Hi, I'm Lily. I study at the University of Birmingham. So I went to the GP about a possible ADHD diagnosis a couple of years ago now, and I was told to fill out the relevant questionnaire. They checked that over. They said I'd be put on a waiting list. They said the waiting list for the diagnosis would be about a year. The next time I speak to them about a year later, they say that they didn't actually put me on the waiting list, but they can see the record of the appointment where they said that they would. They just didn't put me on. At that point, I couldn't really wait any longer. I think the mental health effects of having something like ADHD isn't something that's talked about loads. You hear a lot about it in the terms of like learning difficulty kind of sense, and I just couldn't wait any longer for it. So
what happened?
So we went private, and then when
Do you mind me asking who paid for that, Lily?
my parents. I'm really fortunate to have that. I know so many people wouldn't be in the position to have that at all. I was incredibly
But if you
lucky.
hadn't had that option, if your mum and dad hadn't stepped in to get that private diagnosis, what would have been the impact on you?
I think the effects to my mental health would just be incredibly detrimental. I think it's a lot at uni, like struggling to not only do your uni work, but kind of just like live, you know, simple tasks are really overwhelming, and to go about your day with, I don't know, like living on your own, just trying to make it through is really hard. So I don't know if I would make it through uni sort of without trying to get help for it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in our politicians, if I may. I'm going to start with you, Maria Caulfield, as a health minister. When you hear these stories, how much do you take responsibility, you and your government, for these very long waits to treatment?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And in each of those three cases, you know, I'm very sorry that people have had those waits, and particularly in the breast cancer setting. I was a breast cancer nurse before I came into Parliament, and improving outcomes for breast cancer has been something I've worked hard on throughout my NHS career.
So why
but if you look across all four nations of the United Kingdom, there are similar delays in all, whether it's Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, or in England, which I'm responsible for.
But is that supposed to be some kind of consolation?
To try and improve those waits. Well, I think we have been through a period of COVID where routine testing and routine services, whether that's for physical or mental health, have not been available for 2 years, and people are presenting much sicker than they would had we not had those lockdowns. And what I would say is we are investing in services like never before. So for breast cancer, for example, we are now seeing improvements in survival for women at 10 years. About 80% of women will now survive. And that's because we are improving the treatment that's on offer.
Okay.
In terms of mental health, for example, I think it was Steve who said about talking therapies, you can now self-refer. So anyone who wants to refer for talking therapies can go on our Every Mind Matters website and refer themselves. And we've had 1.9 million people access services through that option.
And how long will it be before they see a talking therapist?
I'm not denying that there are problems. Oh, absolutely weeks. If you self-refer through the Every Mind Matters website, you can
Honestly, people are laughing
talking
here, Maria. I know you're not with us in the room,
weeks.
Maria Caulfield, but there are people laughing at you saying that.
Well, I've spoken to people who've accessed those therapies and they have told me the benefit that they've had, and the fact they haven't had to go and see their GP for referral has really made a difference. And that's why we are expanding that programme, and that's why in the last budget we've put in more money into that so that people don't have to go to a GP for referral, can refer themselves
let me bring in the other politicians.
and access those services direct. So that's not... Okay.
Sorry, Maria Caulfield. I just want to hear from Neil Gray and Helen Morgan and Wes Streeting. Neil Gray, I mean, there are long waiting times in Scotland for treatment compared to England, compared to Wales. Is it all down to COVID?
No, I think, to be fair to Maria, I think she's right that has had an impact. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. But, and by the way, I hope that, Stevie, your recovery goes well, that the treatment is successful, and that that you're getting access to the support that you're needing in order to receive the treatment that you need. And it's true to say that, yes, there are pressures in all elements of the health service, not just in Scotland, but across all nations of the UK. COVID has undoubtedly had an impact. We are seeing more patients presenting in Scotland than we have done before, and we're seeing more patients within the treatment time guarantees, the 31-day and the 62-day pathway, than we did prior to COVID.
Sure.
But on this, Wes Streeting was absolutely right when he said that all roads lead back to Westminster, because the cuts that have come to the NHS in England have a direct impact on our ability in Scotland, and indeed in Wales and other parts of the UK, to be able to fund the services.
No, but health has evolved. You can choose to fund it in different ways, can't you? You can raise taxes in Scotland.
And we're doing that, Victoria. We're doing that. We're taking responsibility for the health service in Scotland.
So why are you blaming Westminster then?
No, I'll come to that, because we've raised an additional £1.5 billion in tax in order to invest in public services. What we're getting from Labour and the Conservatives is a plan for continued austerity, and a plan for £18 billion worth of cuts. That is going to have a direct impact and a consequence on the NHS in Scotland and our ability to be able to continue to fund the services.
Well, let's put that to Wes Streeting. So if Labour win the election, austerity is coming, is it not? Be honest.
No, it's not. And the £2 billion we've already committed in our manifesto would make a real difference in every one of the cases we've just heard about this evening.
That is a tiny amount of money when you look at the total budget of the NHS in England, which is £190 billion.
Well,
£2 billion is a drop.
Well, hang on a sec. I'd say two things about that, and I want to explain what we will do about the state of the NHS. The first thing I'd say generally is, if it were the case that it was just pouring more money in would solve all the problems, then we wouldn't simultaneously have the highest amount of cash being spent on the NHS, which we do today, and the worst crisis in its history. When Andrew Lansley came in after the 2010 election, the Conservatives spent £3 billion on the NHS. All of it went into a top-down reorganisation that nobody wanted, nobody voted for, and left the NHS in a state where waiting lists were at their highest level ever before the pandemic. It's not a virtue to spend loads more money if the money is badly spent. And that's why the £2 billion that we've committed to would pay for 40,000 more appointments every week through evening and weekend clinics to help get waiting lists down, double the number of CT and MRI scanners so that we can diagnose earlier, treat faster, 8,500 extra mental health workers so we can cut NHS mental health waiting lists, which stand at over 1 million. Mental health support in every primary and secondary school in the country. Walk-in mental health hubs in every community, and 700,000 urgent dentistry appointments. So taken together, that would all make a practical difference.
It's a health spending, it's an increase in health spending under Labour, this is what you're offering, of 1.1%. In austerity, under the coalition, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, it went up 1.4%. I mean, you're just behind austerity.
No, I just don't accept. Victoria,
well, I've just given you the figures.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that.
I just don't accept that it's a virtue to spend more money without doing the reform as well.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's a virtue.
About the cost of living crisis, one of the things that makes where we are today much more difficult than 1997 isn't just the state of the NHS, it's the state of the economy and the state of the finances of every family in this country, which means that whereas the last Labour government was able to say, we'll put a penny on national insurance and put the money in the NHS, if we said we're going to put a penny on national insurance, there'd be loads of people who want to see investment in the NHS who would say, I genuinely can't afford to pay higher taxes. I can't afford my rent. I can't afford my mortgages. I can't afford my bill. We are realistic about the challenges that we face, and it's investment and reform that delivers the results. We delivered the shortest waiting times, the highest patient satisfaction ever in the history of the NHS when we were last in government.
Yeah, you were spending loads more money
then. We'll do it again.
Helen Morgan, the Lib Dems, used to say, look, we'll put 2p, 1p on your income tax to pay for the NHS. Now you're saying you'd get all the billions that you want to spend from tax avoidance. I mean, that's not realistic, is it?
Well, I think we've got a very bold and ambitious plan for the NHS, which is £9 billion per year to invest in GPs, to give people a right to see their GP within 7 days, to give them a right to have their cancer treatment starting within 62 days. And we would fund that by taxing the big banks. The Conservatives have cut the banking levy and the banking surcharge. We'd reinstate those. And we would change the way that capital gains tax is levied so that the top 0.1% of the population were paying more. And that would raise the £9 billion we think we need as a starter to invest in the NHS and turn it around.
OK, I'm just going to get a really quick reaction. Stevie, to what you've heard from the politicians, what do you want to say briefly?
I think to Maria Caulfield's point about breast cancer survival rates, I think that's absolutely right. And in some ways, I feel almost weirdly lucky to have got the cancer that I got. You know, I think there was a story in the Mirror earlier today that I read on the train on the way here that said if you've got other types of cancer, you have worse outcomes in the UK than anywhere else in the EU. So, yes, it is true that breast cancer survival rates are good, but I would like to know why is it that if you get other types of cancer in the UK, you're less likely to have a good outcome than you would in other parts of the EU.
Nick Watt is here. He's our political editor. How big an issue is healthcare, health spending, the NHS in this election?
Well, obviously, Vicky, it's a big issue. We've had the opening skirmishes expressed politely by our political guests and very powerful stories from our audience. And one theme that is occurring again and again are waiting lists. Now, waiting lists are a huge issue for two reasons. Firstly, just the human toll, as we've heard. But the second is the politics, because waiting list was one of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges when he outlined those 5 pledges. His view is success. They are down 200,000 from the peak in September 2023. Our opposition guests will say, hold your horses, because that is that is 350,000 higher than when Rishi Sunak outlined that pledge in January 2023. Now, the NHS is a big issue in this campaign, but it's not the biggest issue. So for the Labour Party, what they're talking about is ending what they call the chaos and division of the Conservative government, and they're talking about promoting economic growth. For the Conservative Party, they're warning about what they claim will be tax rises under a Labour government. That is obviously disputed by Labour. But the NHS is still very important for the 4 parties here. So for the Conservatives, for Maria Caulfield, what they want to say is the NHS will be safe in their hands. They'll say that they would increase spending above inflation every year. From Wes Streeting, we had a little bit of a flavour of how Wes Streeting has some pretty tough messages for the Labour movement. He says the NHS is a service, not a shrine, and you cannot just pour money in without reform. For the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, the leader, everyone has praised a very moving video that he did talking about caring for his son. And for the SNP, they are saying that the NHS shows the importance of independence, because they're saying, look at what Westminster austerity they they would say has done to NHS funding in Scotland.
OK. I'm going to hear from more in the audience, if I may, but just let me tell you, if you want to listen to a live audio version of Newsnight, along with all the BBC's election coverage, then you need to go to Election 2024 on BBC Sounds. It's a continuous stream. Right now, you can hear Newsnight. Perhaps you just want to hear our voices rather than see our faces. I don't know. You can find the stream. It's between 5 Live Sports Extra and 6 Music. Let's hear from Lizzie, who is here with her newborn baby, can you believe? Lucy, who has been very, very good. Hi, Lizzie. What do you do for a living?
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I'm a mental health nurse, and I work with the most hardworking and compassionate of colleagues. They are utterly fabulous. However, we see the daily challenges of how stretched mental health, both inpatient and outpatient services are. Personally, I had a loved one who had to wait 10 days for an acute mental health bed because there were none available across the country. And
Sorry, across the country?
Nationally, across the country. And my 5-year-old son has been told he has to wait 5 years for an autism and ADHD assessment. I'm really curious to understand what you would do if you came into power to shorten these waiting lists.
I mean, I've got my facts and figures here. There are thousands of mental health vacancies in the NHS. It's not just an issue in England. I'm just trying to find my correct card. I think it's 28,500, if I remember correctly, mental health vacancies in the NHS in England, Maria Caulfield. I mean, we've just heard from 2 people out of the audience of about 50. Mental health is a massive issue. If you were to be re-elected, how would you make sure that someone who needs an acute hospital bed isn't waiting 10 days for it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've seen demand for mental health services increase by over 40% in the last 3 years. So whether that's young children and young people or whether that's adult mental health, we are investing like never before. We're putting £2.3 billion extra a year into mental health services. That has meant that we've been able to deliver 27,000 additional mental health staff. It means that we have been able to open crisis centres in every part of the country to try and get in at an earlier stage to avoid admissions, and we've been able to reduce admissions by 18% successfully. We've opened 24/7 helplines, which people can access via 111. But despite all of that investment, and we've got half of our schools now have got mental health support teams in there already, but despite all of that investment, all of that extra resources, we are still struggling to keep up with demand. And so I absolutely recognise that things aren't where we want them to be. But we have put mental health services on a parity of esteem with physical health services.
No, you haven't.
But we are struggling to meet that 40% increase in demand across the board.
I'm really sorry, you haven't. I know you've said that. I remember Nick Clegg saying it when he was Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition government. That was always the aim. It has not happened.
Well, we've put in £2.3 billion extra a year
but just
into,
because you say
into
there's
mental health
parity.
services. That has never, ever happened before. We're increasing the number of mental health services. We're putting in mental health ambulances, for example. That has never happened before. So yes, we've got catch up to do in relation to physical health, but that is, never ever happened before under any previous government at all.
Right. Would you say, Wes Streeting, there's parity between mental health and physical health in this country?
There's parity insofar as waiting lists are at record levels in physical health and mental health, so well done. I think getting the Conservatives back in for an unprecedented 5th term would be like handing the matches back to the arsonists and say finish the job with the NHS. I think it would be a total disaster.
So there are 28,600 vacancies. That was 100 out in NHS mental health services as of September last year. Where could you find 30,000 professionals to fill those gaps were you to win?
Well, of course it takes time. We would start with 8,500 extra mental health staff to cut those waiting lists that currently stand at over a million.
Are they just sort of sitting around waiting to start?
There are more applications for those posts than there are posts available, which is the madness of the situation. We've got to recruit staff into those positions. We'll also have walk-in mental health hubs in every community and mental health support in every primary and secondary school.
And in communities, what do you mean?
Intervening earlier and in every local authority area, so 152. And that would make a really enormous difference, both in terms of getting the waiting list down that are already there, but also trying to intervene earlier so that people's mental illness doesn't turn into a mental health crisis in the way that it currently is. And that's a fully costed, fully funded policy that would make a real difference for people right across the country.
Obviously, it's an issue in Scotland, like it is in England, like it is in Wales and Northern Ireland. Do you have a solution, or is it the Westminster government's fault if there is a problem?
No, we are investing in mental health services. Of course, I'm not going to say that the picture is rosy in Scotland, because obviously we have waits there as well. But to challenge Wes directly, you cannot cut your way to reform and improvement. Labour's plans, the IPPR and the Nuffield Trust have said, would mean that it would be austerity, continued austerity.
He's already said no, that won't happen. So do you want to talk to each other?
I'm sorry, because the independent IPPR and the independent Nuffield Trust have said that under Labour's plans of £18 billion worth of cuts to public services and their plans for the NHS, it would mean austerity beyond which was delivered by the Tories between 2010 and 2024.
Let him respond.
That is an appalling betrayal. It is not change, it's continued short change.
I'd say two things in response to Neil. Firstly, as I've said before, of course, what happens in Westminster impacts on Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which is why I think Neil would agree, off camera, if not on camera, a Labour government would be better for Scotland than a Conservative government, which is one of the reasons why people in Scotland should send Scottish Labour MPs to replace the Conservatives rather than sending to oppose the Conservatives.
With the
Tories. Let me tell you about
appalling.
the squeeze on. This is where this comes to the responsibility of your government. When the SNP came to power in 2007, health spending per person was 17% higher than in England. Today, it's 3%. So the choices that successive SNP ministers have made in Scotland has squeezed the budget. And even now, in Scotland, a nurse is paying a higher rate of taxation than a nurse in England at the same time as you oppose a real windfall tax on oil and gas companies because of the SNP's vested interest. So don't just sit there blaming the Conservatives. Take some responsibility for your own government. And final thing I'd say, especially to the point Lily raised earlier about people having to pay to go private, which I think is just a total disgrace that people are forced into that position. And it also means people from working class families are often left behind. Where there is spare capacity in the private sector, we will pay for people to go private on NHS terms so that it's fairer.
There is no spare capacity in the private sector.
There is, Victoria.
The people who work in the NHS also work in the private sector. The health think tanks say that. Just because someone can't be seen in the NHS doesn't mean they can be seen in the private sector.
And I wish we lived in a world where every physician and every health worker wanted to work in the NHS, not the independent sector. But that's where the capacity is. And before Neil Gray sits there and once again accuses me of wanting to privatise the NHS, to which I say, over my dead body, your government in Scotland has done the same thing and has increased use of the private sector since 2018. So even if you weren't sat in this studio, we would smell the stench of SNP hypocrisy all the way across England. That's exactly what you're doing in Scotland. Stop scaremongering and take responsibility for your government's abysmal record.
You've got one sentence and then I need to bring Helen Morgan in.
If we had followed the spending plans of Westminster, we would have had cumulative £15 billion less spent over the time of government of the SNP in Scotland. Labour's plan for health spending...
Do you know what? I'm going to pause you there, because Labour can talk about their plan.
Well, he's directly attacked the government's record in Scotland, and I wish to challenge the situation that has been offered by the Labour Party.
Briefly.
The Labour Party's investment, so-called investment in the health service, would be worth £134 million in Scotland. That's less than what was passed on by the Tories the last time round, and would be barely enough to cover a 1% pay rise for our NHS staff.
Right, I'm going to pause you there.
Imagine putting that to our workers in the health service.
Thank you, Neil Gray.
Mental health staff and others.
Thank you, Neil Gray. Thank you.
Not further
Thank you. Helen Morgan.
Well, I think it's really important to recognise that we need community support for people, so community health hubs, a mental health professional in every single school, because what's driving the crisis is that we don't have early enough intervention. So people are going through their lives, not getting the talking therapy when they need it, as we heard from Steve earlier, and then they need this crisis intervention later on. And that's too late, because not only is it more expensive for the taxpayer, it's ruined that person's life in the meantime.
Sure.
So we need to have a mental health checkup for people at vulnerable times in their life. So, for example, and speaking from experience, after you have a baby, that's a very, very vulnerable point in your life where you're prone to depression, somebody coming and asking you how you're getting on and just talking to you about how you're feeling would make all the world of difference then.
Okay.
So we would like to see not only the mental health hubs and the health professionals in schools, but those interventions as you go through your life to try and prevent the crisis occurring.
Thank you. Nick, tell us what the Greens are proposing. Tell us what Reform are proposing.
Well, Carlia Denyer, who is the co-leader of the Green Party in England and Wales, she's talking about how they would like to tackle what she describes as chronic underinvestment in the NHS. So she's talking about a £30 billion increase in funding for the health service, a £20 billion increase in social care. She said really important because the two of those are inextricably linked, and then a one-off £20 billion capital investment to tackle the crumbling health estate. That will be paid for by raising between 50 to 70 billion a year by the end of the next Parliament, which would be in wealth taxes. So if you happen to have £10 million or more in the bank, the Greens are coming after you. For Reform UK, they stress the NHS under them would be free at the point of delivery. But Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, he says that the NHS funding model is not working. And so he's been talking about a French-style social insurance scheme in which through your taxes you would contribute to that. If you can afford it, you pay. If you can't afford it, you wouldn't pay. But it's interesting, Nigel Farage talks about free at the point of delivery, because in France, some services are not entirely free. For example, GP appointments. You get most of it back, but you don't necessarily get it all back. Plaid Cymru. So Rian Al Yurath, who is the Plaid Cymru leader, he's talking about a double whammy for the NHS in Wales. He's talking about the impact of austerity cuts introduced by the UK government, but he's also talking about how the NHS in Wales has been badly run by the Labour administration there, and he is stressing that the cooperation agreement that Plaid has had with the Labour Party in Wales did not cover the NHS. So for Plaid, they're talking about how they're in double opposition to the UK government and opposition to the Labour-devolved administration.
On the subject of an insurance-style system, yes or no? Would you support an insurance-style system of funding in this country? No. I think most people said no. We've got some GPs in the audience. We've got some people who've waited a long time to see a GP. Who here has waited more than a week to try and get a GP's appointment? Stick your hand in the air. Keep your hand up. What about, and we've got politicians as well sticking their hand up, what about waiting 2 weeks to see a GP? Still a few hands up, including Helen Morgan and Wes Streeting. 3 weeks? OK, even 3 weeks, goodness me. Yes, hello, sir.
Hi, I'm Gavin Shields. I'm a GP partner in Coventry. We all know that we've got far too many patients struggling to get timely appointments to see their GPs. We've powerfully heard that causes fear, that causes worsening health, it blights lives, put lives on hold. And quite frankly, it costs an awful lot more money in the long run. Now, we really, really would like to employ more GPs in our practices.
Why don't you?
Well, we also know that we've got a significant number of general practitioners at the moment unemployed and unable to find work, which is absolutely scandalous.
So employ
and such
more?
a waste. We can't.
Why not?
We can't because the core funding that goes into our practices is not enough because it's fallen in real terms. And in England, the money we are given to employ additional staff, the contract states we are not allowed to employ GPs.
Why not?
Because we are not allowed to draw the funds down to employ general practitioners.
OK, can I ask Maria Caulfield what the rationale for that is? Maria Caulfield, why can't Gavin employ more GPs in his surgery? Briefly, if you would, Maria Caulfield, because I want to go back to Gavin.
Yeah, so the core budget that he's talking about, that was under negotiation just before the general election was called to increase that budget overall, which would be for GPs. But the additional role scheme that he's talking about is specifically for roles within a GP practice for other healthcare professionals, so nurses, paramedics, physios. And that was being agreed with GPs around, and they're asked for being able to employ different types of healthcare professionals in primary care. But in order to employ more GPs, the negotiations for the general contract was ongoing just before the election was called.
OK. So you can employ other people to help?
Well, we can't employ practice nurses. We can employ advanced nurse practitioners, but not practice nurses.
OK. we've got other GPs here. I wonder, Gavin, do you mind passing the microphone down to Sarah, unless Sarah's got one? She's got one, perfect. How long have you been a GP for, Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a GP in Birmingham. I've been a GP for almost 25 years now. And my experience is I love being a GP. I still do, but it's almost unrecognisable than what the job was when I first qualified.
Are you able to, do you think you give a better or worse service 25 years on compared to when you started?
So I think overall, it's better in terms of medical treatment. So when I was a medical student, for example, the first active treatments for heart attacks were only just beginning to come in. Prior to that, that didn't exist. Now we have much better treatments, we have preventative measures, we have things that can prevent cardiovascular disease, which is fantastic. But what it also means is that we've got an increasingly ageing population who have chronic, complex health needs that we have to manage, and it all takes time. And it feels like the NHS hasn't really caught up with that.
Okay, so you've got a brief experience you want to share?
Yes, my name's Akhtiar from Coventry. I've been waiting for nearly 2 weeks now to have a doctor's appointment. I phoned them at 8 o'clock in the morning, as they asked us, and but by you get into queue, and by 8:30 they phone you, say all appointments have gone. I've been waiting, and it's just it's a pain, basically, because I do
literally.
Yeah. I've been waiting for ages, basically.
Okay. Yes, sir. Hello, and then microphone to Teresa. Go. Hello.
Hi, my name's Ivan. I'm a dentist, worked in Coventry for 30-odd years. There's a concern about access to dental practice.
Okay, so we've got concerns about access to GPs, we've got concerns about access to dentists.
There's stories of people having to extract their own teeth, and we see the promise in the manifestos of recovery for dental surgeries and promising, and only promising £1 million or £2 million. I understand since 2010, the real reduction in dental funding is around £1 billion. I'd be interested to know what they have to say about that. And also, just one quick thing, they seem scared to be talking about tax. I understand from the recent social attitude survey, the majority of people would be happy to pay a little extra tax if it went into NHS clinical funding.
Is that okay? That's interesting. Sounds like there's a bit of support there. I just want to show you this footage and show our audience, wherever they're watching around the country, this footage that we actually brought you on Newsnight last month. And as you can see, it shows patient after patient stuck in corridors at Norfolk and Norwich University hospitals. And I know that is an experience that some of you can relate to.
Hi, my name is Paul Curtis. I'm from Coventry. And I have an 88-year-old mother and an 88-year-old father. My mother fell out of the bed and my father is not strong enough now to lift her off the floor. Calls the paramedics and they say 1 hour. So he gets her a cushion and puts a duvet over her and makes her comfortable. 1 hour goes, no paramedics. Calls them again. Sorry, we're really, really busy. Will be another hour. Another hour goes, he calls them again. Sorry, we're really busy tonight. We're going to send an ambulance from Stoke-on-Trent an hour away to get to my mother who's been on the floor for 3 hours. Yeah? It's not on. You know, you need to do something about this. I've had a situation where the paramedics took me in and waited 6 hours before they left because they weren't allowed to leave me until I'd been seen in a corridor. 9 hours I was in a corridor.
This is not an uncommon experience. And you're all shaking your heads like this is awful and this is unacceptable. And yet it's not an uncommon experience at West Streeting. What would you do to stop stuff like that happening?
Yeah, I'll come back to all of the points. I had a very similar experience in my family. An elderly relative fell in the street, and in the end, it was only thanks to the kindness of the neighbours who unhinged one of their doors, brought it out onto the street because it was cold, there was snow on the ground, and lifted him onto the door and put him into the back of an estate car and took him to hospital, that he got to A&E. And I don't know where he would have been were it not for that kindness. We've got a situation now where the ambulance delays are atrocious right across the country. There have been particular problems here in the West Midlands, but it's true right across the country. problems with ambulance handovers. You've got hospitals that are completely clogged up. And I think
What's the answer?
The answer to that, I think, there's twofold. You have to try and reduce the pressure at the front door of the hospital. So going back to the point about general practice, I think it's crazy, by the way, we've got this situation where we've got qualified GPs who can't find a job and patients who can't get a GP appointment. I do want to see more diverse roles in general practice, but the current scheme is obviously far too restrictive and there's a lack of common sense, and I will absolutely look at that. But we also need to train up thousands more GPs. There are 2,000 fewer GPs now.
Okay.
You're doing 1 million more appointments than before the pandemic, so we need to train up more GPs, cut through the red tape that holds you back, make sure you can spend more time with the family-doctor relationship, more incentives into continuity of care for that family-doctor relationship, and that will make a big difference at the front door. The exit door in social care, we've got to deal with delayed discharge. I was at a hospital in London the other day. 60 days a patient had been on a ward, fit to go home, but there wasn't the care in the community. Now that costs and this goes back to my point about, I know money's an issue, but it goes back to the point about reform. Thousands of pounds would be spent on keeping that patient in a hospital bed every day. It would be cheaper to spend a fraction of that money with support either in an intermediate step-down hospital or in their home. Similarly, if you can get a GP appointment, it costs 40 quid, A&E £400. So, you know, I understand people say more money for the NHS. Of course, that's what I want to deliver to, and we will.
OK.
But also look at the £170 million that's going in now. Look at the waste, look at the inefficiency, look at that crazy red tape we heard described in general practice.
Let me go to Marie Caulfield.
We also need to reform the way the NHS works. Otherwise, we will just pour more and more money into the system like water into a leaky bucket and wonder, as we are today, how it is that a Prime Minister can say we're spending more than ever before, and yet we see the NHS has never been in such a grave crisis.
Maria Caulfield, I just want you to read some facts to you about the record of the last 14 years. Vacancies within the NHS are around 9%, despite an increase in staff. The NHS is short of 4,000 GPs. You promised in 2019 you'd recruit 6,000. You've failed to reach that target. There are 152,000 vacancies in social care. 12% of acute hospital beds are taken up by a patient who can't be discharged because there's no one outside of the hospital for them. Per person spending, according to the Nuffield Trust, per person spending in the UK, it's $5,000. It's below most Western European nations. It's below Germany. It's below Switzerland. It's below the US, who spend nearly $12,000 per person compared to the $5,000 we spend here in the UK. Perhaps that is why the NHS is so stretched.
Well, I mean, if you listen to Wes, you think things would be wonderful under a Labour government. When I was working in A&E as a nurse under the last Labour government, we had people queuing in ambulances to be admitted to A&E. We had patients being treated in corridors. This is not a new phenomenon.
Sure.
And what
so
we've done,
so it hasn't got better under the last 14 years, has it?
Well, you know, actually, in Labour-run Wales, there are, you know, worse waiting times in A&E. We've got people waiting 28 hours to be unloaded from an ambulance into A&E in Wales. So there's similar problems across all the devolved nations. But what we've done in England... this winter, we created 10,000 virtual beds. That's beds in the community, so people could be cared for in the community, not be admitted, or if they were in hospital and needed to be discharged, they could be. And that meant that this winter we didn't have the same pressures that we had the previous year in terms of ambulance waits, in terms of patients being treated in corridors or cubicles in A&E. And we have seen, you know, we've started to meet our A&E 4-hour waits as a result of that.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that there aren't problems and there aren't pressures, but we do know from our work that there are specific hospitals and specific places in England that are struggling more than others. Okay. In other parts of England, we've seen a reduction in our CAT2 ambulance response times by 20 minutes. So we are seeing the green shoots of recovery because of the investment we're putting in.
Let me ask
and the
the
way
audience
we're
here.
spending that money
Do you think we're seeing the green shoots of recovery in the NHS? No. OK, Neil Gray.
I think the challenges that have been set out here are real and are challenges that are shared across the UK. What we are seeing in Scotland is we've got the best performing accident emergency departments in the UK.
Which is still your worst figures for something like 9 years, 12 years? 9
years, the best performing accident emergency services anywhere in the UK. We've got more GPs per head of population than any part of the United Kingdom, and we've got a record number, 1,200 GPs in training. So if there are GPs, Gavin's colleagues, that are looking for work, come to Scotland, because we'd more than happily take them. But I think the dentist
We're nearly at the end of the programme, I should say.
cut to the nub of the situation here, and this is about funding of public services. And if the UK government, whether it was the conspiracy of silence between Labour and the Conservatives on austerity, were to match our taxation, progressive taxation in Scotland, there would be £15 billion extra in the health service in England available for spending. That would be transformational. So why is there this conspiracy of silence on austerity?
All right.
And why are they not willing to invest in the public services that you all deserve?
Wes Streeton was shaking his head in disagreement. I want to hear from Helen Morgan. We are coming to the end of the programme. Helen Morgan, go ahead.
So in rural areas, I'm afraid the experience that gentleman just described would be not a bad one. Where I live, people wait for 18, 24, 36 hours in plastic chairs on corridors. They're left to soil themselves because there's no one there to care for them. You can wait 5 weeks.
Where do you live?
In Shropshire.
Right.
5 weeks for a non-urgent GP appointment. There's only one dentist in North Shropshire taking on new NHS patients. And that's because the way that the government look at this doesn't take rural areas into account. So in addition to all of the measures that we need to take in employing more staff, we need to have a rural safeguarding as well to make sure that we're attracting people to work in rural areas and funding places where it costs a lot to deliver services more appropriately.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Listen, there we must leave it. Thank you very much to our politicians this evening. We really appreciate you giving up your time. I know it's a really busy time for you all. And thank you so much to our audience here in Birmingham. Well done. Good night.